Anthony Albanese has boasted in the past that he's never lost a news poll. Well, that ends today. Just months out from polling day, the Prime Minister's re-election prospects are now looking shaky, with Peter Dutton ahead of Albanese in the polls for the first time. It wasn't so long ago now that Albanese claimed he'd never lost a poll.
We haven't lost a news poll, unlike every other government during every term, since news polls started, I think.
Words he'll rue today as news poll shows that the coalition leads Labor on both a primary and two-party preferred basis. The coalition's primary is at 38%, while Labor's primary at 31%. And that's lower than the 32.6% that they recorded at the last election. And as you know, that was already historic lows. Then on a two-party preferred basis, the coalition now ahead of Labor, 51 to 49%. And this is because there's been a shift in preference flows. It's the first time since the last election that the credible polling outfit, Newspoll, has the coalition ahead of Labor. Now, Labor MPs and insiders are getting nervous. But publicly, from the Prime Minister down, they insisted today that there was nothing to see here.
I'm very focused on continuing to lead a majority government.
There are obviously news polls where you're doing better than other times and others where you're doing less well.
We're not focused on the polls because what we're focused on is cost of living for ordinary Australians. We're focused, we're doing the right thing. It's a very close poll.
There's going to be polls of individual seats, of the nation, all the rest. What we know is that when the election comes, it'll be a choice between our plans for the future or Peter Dutton's lack of plans for the future.
Now, poor polls have been the undoing of several Prime Ministers. Malcolm Turnbull used the fact that Tony Abbott had lost 30 news polls as just cause when he tore his Prime Ministership down.
The one thing that is clear about our current situation is the trajectory. We have lost 30 news polls in a row. It is clear that the people have made up their mind about Mr Abbott's leadership.
Then when Turnbull himself lost an equal number of polls, that led to concern about his own leadership. And eventually, Peter Dutton came after him. A leadership coup I broke on the front page at the time. Julia Gillard was also floundering in the polls when Kevin Rudd came after her and seized back the leadership ahead of the September 2013 election.
And the truth is, if we're all being perfectly honest about it right now, is that we're on course for a catastrophic defeat, unless there is change.
But Rudd, in his second Prime Ministership, didn't perform any better, with Tony Abbott winning a landslide 14 seats. And now Albanese has lost his first poll, and it could get a lot worse in the next 7 months before polling day. The momentum has now been in Peter Dutton's favour for a year. There are many complicating factors, including the Teals, the Greens, and those independent Muslim candidates. But it's not looking good for Albanese. Now, there was a great line in the Fin Review today where journalist James Curran wrote that Albanese has always been an excellent party organiser and factional leader. But he said that Albanese's Prime Ministership is defined predominantly by situation politics. He operates in the moment, surviving it before fleeing to the next. And you just can't argue with it. Albanese has a long list of failures over the past year. But then it's hard to cite any way in which he's actually made our country a better place. Exactly a year ago today, there was the failure of the Voice referendum, which was meant to be the Prime Minister's legacy. But in fact, he personally turned Australians who initially supported the Voice against it by accusing voters of racism and misinformation. He is responsible for its failure. He didn't bother to find a proposal that would have bipartisan support because he didn't want to share the glory when it passed, as he believed that it would. Then there's the immigration crisis, where hundreds of criminals were released onto our streets, free to allegedly bash grandmothers and reoffend. There's his comprehensive failure to deal with anti-Semitism, which I've spoken about at length, his flawed decision to fast-track visas for nearly 3,000 Gazans, including some with Hamas links. Albanese is also pushing through a highly concerning misinformation bill. He's running a big Australia policy that's put pressure on the housing crisis, and this is helping to keep inflation persistent. He's cowering to China, while our defence personnel have faced aggression and attacks from Beijing. And in terms of Albanese's management style, he lacks authority. Left-wing figure Penny Wong is believed to have more command in cabinet than the Prime Minister. And unlike former Prime Ministers, Scott Morrison, Tony Abbott, even Turnbull and Kevin Rudd, Albanese doesn't bother to get across policy detail that his own government is asking Australians to support. He's either too lazy, too disinterested, or simply not bright enough. And then he's caught out and left to clean up the mess when those very policies that he didn't bother to get across cause massive backlash. We saw this with Tanya Plibersek's environment laws and Andrew Giles's mess in immigration. The problem is that Albanese never believed he'd end up as PM. When Bill Shorten was Labor leader, sure, Albanese leaked against him and agitated, but he wasn't truly desperate for the top job. If it didn't come, he would have been fine to continue leaking away in the media as infrastructure minister in a Shorten government. So Albanese hadn't spent his time thinking deeply about his vision for Australia if he were Prime Minister. It was a surprise to Albo when Shorten lost the election and he became the opposition leader. And that's the history that has got us to where we are today. Albanese's failures as Prime Minister are comprehensive and unforgivable. In particular, the explosion in racism towards Jews and the lawlessness and support for terror that's been largely condoned on our streets. Albanese squanders our multicultural success story while Australians are living in a prolonged cost of living crisis. And all the while, he has no grand vision for our country and no command of ministerial briefs.